in anticipation of the upcoming Superman movie directed by James Gunn. This week on The Byword, we dive deep into the various origin stories of Superman and choose the best, which will survive. The Byword starts now. Ladies and gentlemen, nerds, welcome to episode 194 of the Nerd Byword podcast, a truly super episode, if you get my meaning. I am Dave, I'm here with my buddy Chris, and this week we are doing a deep dive into 3 different origin stories for Superman. The good, the bad, and which one comes out as the best origin for the Man of Steel. But before we get there, let's go ahead and talk about something a little different. It's time for... Chris, what's new?
Okay, so this has been a favorite project to look forward to for mine, and I don't know that it's ever going to see the light of day, pun fully intended. Marvel's Blade lost its second director, Jan Demange. So this was announced way back before pre-pandemic, if you can think back that far. It was a surprise announcement at San Diego Comic-Con 2019 at the very end of Marvel's Hall H presentation. Kevin Feige called out Mahershala Ali and presented him with a Blade baseball cap. Ali would go on to have a voice acting credit as Blade at the end credit scene of Eternals, but it's been a whole lot of turmoil since then. Was supposed to go into production the fall of 2022. Director Bassem Tariq exited over creative differences. Then it was rumored that Mahershala Ali handpicked Lovecraft Country director Demange. Months later, it became one of the things that was delayed by the writer's strike of May 2023. As of yet, it still has yet to go into production, and now you have Demange, the second director, leaving. Now, as of the time of recording, Mahershala Ali is still attached, but this is really unfortunate news and not what we wanted to see, Dave.
You know, on the one hand, bad news that it's constantly getting delayed and going through turmoil. On the other hand, I think there is a positive spin that we can take on this. And that is that they're actually putting in the work to try to create a positive product here. We've previously talked about how a lot of stuff that we've heard behind the scenes about the MCU from various trades, Variety and the like, has been that their tendency was to fix everything in post, right? Instead of actually like getting their ducks in a row before they even start shooting. And that's why we've had a lot of lackluster products coming out of the MCU recently. And there have been reports that they want to change this approach and then they want to do more of the work up front, including actually having showrunners on some of their shows for Disney Plus. And so if that's really the case, this could be an indication that they're actually putting in the work up front to make this a quality product rather than trying to rush it out the door and or try to fix it in post after it's been already filmed. So I'm having at least some hope that they're putting in the necessary work to make this a good product. You know, Blade has never been like my absolute favorite character, but you know, especially the first couple of movies featuring Wesley Snipes in the role are sort of seminal comic book adaptations, right? Mm-hmm. And so getting this right, I think, is extremely important. So I will say kudos if that's actually what's going on. It'd be much more troubling if the real reason that they can't get their ducks in a row here is not because they're going through a rigorous creative process, but because they have no idea what to do with this movie. So that would be much more troubling. I'm hoping that it is the first and not the latter reason.
Do you think it's an Edgar Wright situation, like what would happen with Ant-Man?
I really don't know. I think the MCU is. Um, Look, I think it's probably fair what Russell Crowe recently said. I don't know if you saw any of those reports, Chris, but Russell Crowe was
I
like
think
asked
so.
about being cast in like superhero movies, and he said, "This is not the life-altering event that you think it is. It is a job. You need to show up and do what they ask you to do, and then move on with life." Basically, I'm kind of paraphrasing
Hmm.
here. I think that goes for directors too. I think oftentimes directors come in with a very strong vision, and it's preferable if you let them cook, if you ask me. But I think with huge
Right.
machines like the MCU in particular, I think there's a lot of executive meddling, and I think there are directors that are going to have to learn that to a certain extent. They are as a part of this huge machine, a gun for hire, right? That they are going to have to kind of bend
Hmm.
to the executive a little bit, and oftentimes I think the reason you get these creative differences splits is because the executives want what they want, and the directors don't want to compromise their vision, right? Um, but when you have this large machine like the MCU, ultimately a director will dip in and out of something like that for one movie, maybe two or three. But the larger machine has to keep churning, and there has to be somebody, in this case Feige, right, who has to keep the whole thing churning. Um, and so ultimately, uh, that is probably part of it. I think it's very difficult sometimes to put your own ideas and creativity a little bit on the back burner and say, okay, this is what they want, and so I have to figure out a way to make that work rather than I have this much cooler idea that I'd rather do, you know?
Which and I understand both sides. I understand, Sam Raimi immediately comes to mind with the Multiverse of Madness, which is oddly a maligned film, in my opinion. I don't think it was the best MCU film, but I think it was fun and I think it was unique and it stood out. So it feels like sometimes fans are talking out of two sides of their mouth because they want directors to have unique vision, but when they do something like that, it's like, no, not like that. So I'm kind of, but I also get where Feige et al. Are coming from because they have to make this a cohesive, connected universe. And sometimes that comes with certain hindrances that are inherent to the whole idea of that.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair.
All right, Dave, I'm very excited to talk about your nerd news story.
Yeah, I think it's probably fair to say that Microsoft has had a difficult time over the last few years, kind of operating in the shadow of Sony's PlayStation brand, right? Um, and there's been a lot of stuff that we've reported over the last few years as the Xbox brand has been kind of trying to play catch up, founding new studios, buying various large studios, companies, and the like, right? Really trying to build something up. And the idea was that, the good is going to start slowly coming out of this as they're kind of building a new base for developing games. And apparently, slowly we're starting to see their fortunes turn a little bit. Now, let's be honest. In this particular generation, Xbox is hopelessly behind in console sales, behind Sony's PlayStation. And it's also probably fair to say that Xbox is slowly turning away from the notion of exclusives as the main way in which they make money. In fact, they're starting to look at putting some of their own, games um, on PlayStation as well. So this whole like console war thing is something that they don't seem to be particularly interested in. But we're sort of in this announcement season, right? And Xbox just had its games showcase not too long ago, as of recording, was on June 9th, and it was a banger of a show. I kind of, look at some of the announcements always when these, game showcases happen in the summer, and I wasn't really expecting a whole lot. And holy smokes, dude! Like I was really, really impressed with I guess the breadth of like all the different things that they have on their slate suddenly. And I mean, there's a lot. In fact, there's so much here. I don't think we really can talk about everything, but I want to kind of mention a couple of highlights that I saw. We got a gameplay trailer for Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, and the gameplay, which is first person, looks actually to be very very smooth. The tone is spot on. It looks like the game really is capturing sort of what makes Indiana Jones, right? Um, we got another cinematic trailer for the new Fable game, and I really, really, the more I'm seeing of that game, the more I can't wait
Yes.
to play it. I kind of really missed that irreverent tone that the Fables games always had, right? Like they didn't mind getting serious, but they also kind of had like a very jokey nature to them. And this trailer absolutely nailed that. If the gameplay is even half as good as the tone of this trailer, I'm gonna have hours of fun with the Return of Fable. And I think this
Hmm.
is really weird. I think the developer behind the new Fable is like the people that usually make like the Forza Horizon games or something. It's like how that translated, I don't know, but it looks really really good. They also had at their showcase a new Life is Strange game, which was exciting for me. I'm a big fan of that franchise, and they're actually bringing back the protagonist from the original Life is Strange, Max Caulfield. She's older here, actually a college student, and I'm very, very interested to see where that's going. Um, she was always an interesting character to begin with, and so I'm totally here for this. I'm actually really tempted for the first time in a long time to do like a digital pre-order for that one. I'm excited. Like I just want to play that on my Steam Deck. Like that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna be honest with you. The thing that I think really though kind of took the sort of the cake for me at least is that we got our first look at the new Perfect Dark. Um, Now, just a bit of history here. Perfect Dark, the original Perfect Dark game, was the successor developed by Rare for GoldenEye. GoldenEye is sort of the standard of like console first person shooters of that generation, having come out on the N64 and really bringing first person shooters to home consoles, right? And then Perfect Dark was sort of the evolution of that. And then Rare was bought up, and by the time the Xbox 360 came out, was owned by Microsoft, and they tried to do a sequel. It was called Perfect Dark Zero, I believe. It was as a prequel, and it kind of came out to sort of mixed reviews. And ever since then, the franchise has sort of lay dormant. And people have a lot of fond memories of Perfect Dark. Really, if you were in that scene of N64 players during that time period, Perfect Dark is right up there with GoldenEye as one of the best experiences on the system. And so people have been clamoring for a long time to get Perfect Dark back. And here we got our first look at a new Perfect Dark game. And holy crap, dude! I'm not the biggest first person shooter player, but this thing looks amazing. So like the traversal is very like parkour like, almost something like out of Mirror's Edge. The gunplay looks really good. The gameplay looks smooth as all get out. I'm really really excited to get my hands on this. So there was just a lot here. Like that is like Shattered Space expansion is coming for Starfield, and there's a new Metal Gear Solid that was showcased. Like there's I think it's a remake. Like there's all sorts of really really cool stuff on the books here. Gears of War prequel, Gears of War E-Day, which also looked really good. I'm not the biggest Gears player. I like the first one quite a bit though, so playing a prequel might be interesting. Like there's some good stuff on the books here, and I was really really just excited because all of this stuff is day and date and Game Pass too. So it's kind of easy to jump right into some of this stuff, Chris.
Yeah, it was a pretty big feast, and there was something for everybody because you have like they the games that make the bucks for them with Call of Duty Black Ops 6, and then you have like the fun stuff that kind of the the nerds go for. Like I'm geeked for Age of Mythology Retold. Like I'm a huge Age of Empires fan. I love those games, and so having Age of Mythology kind of like a remastered game looks incredible. With some new elements into it. Um Of course, we got some more looks at Assassin's Creed Shadows. The Fable is absolutely got me geeked. I'm thinking about jumping back on Fallout 76. They've got new stuff for that coming out, but I think the one that really kind of caught me by surprise and grabbed my attention the most was this new game called South of Midnight. It was like a cinematic trailer and a gameplay trailer, and it's like this fantasy set in the Mississippi Delta where you meet this girl named Hazel, and like there's magic and there's large creatures that come to life. It looks really, really cool and fascinating, and I can't wait to play that one. But like I said, there's just something for everybody here, and it's a good time to be both an Xbox gamer and, now that I've upgraded my PC, a PC gamer as well.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And it's just nice to see. I think you know one of the big criticisms I think that's been leveled now against Microsoft repeatedly about its Xbox brand over and over again is where the games at, where the games at, where the games at, and it's nice to finally see the games are starting to come again, right? And it's been sort of going. The company's been going through a rebuilding process big time, and I don't know why in the world they kind of slacked off on just like trying to produce some really good games, but things seem to be turning around, and if that's really the case, if we're really, finally on the right track again, I think that is just really really exciting, and man, I can't wait to get a hold of Fable. Like that's just my thing. I just want to get a hold of Fable right now. I want to play the
Yeah.
crap out of Fable. That looks so
Yep.
good. That's so up my alley.
Absolutely.
Alrighty, folks, there you have it. That's it for Nerd News. What did you think of the Xbox showcase, the games showcase for the summer, and what are your thoughts on what's going on with the MCU Blade movie? Find us on social media at Nerd Byword or individually at that Nerd Dave and at that Nerd Chris, and let us know how you feel. Let's take a quick break, and when we're back, it's going to be time to talk Superman, and boy oh boy, can't I wait to talk about Superman. All right, ladies and gentle nerds, we are back, and it's one of my favorite topics. We get to talk about Superman in this week's Byword. So, as we are celebrating next year's release of Superman, originally called Superman Legacy, the new Superman movie directed by James Gunn, there's a lot to be excited for. Obviously, we're going to get a brand new Superman, brand new Lois Lane, a new DC cinematic universe, so to speak. And so the question then becomes, what kind of things are you looking for in a Superman movie? What kind of things are you looking for in an origin story for the Man of Steel? And so Chris and I have decided to look at probably the three most prominent versions of Superman's origin that are floating around out there these days. The Man of Steel, a miniseries published in 1986 by John Byrne and Dick Giordano. My
There you
pronunciation
go.
is My pronunciation is awful today. Again, you're welcome. Superman Birthright, which was a 12-issue maxi series that came out between 2003 and 2004 by Mark Waid and Leinil Francis Yu. And Superman Secret Origin, which was released between 2009 and 2010 by Geoff Johns with art by Gary Frank. So these are probably not the only Superman origins out there, but each of these at one point was sort of considered the official origin story of the mainline DC Superman. And so it was worth diving into these. And we're going to kind of critique each one of these. We're going to talk about the things we liked and the things we didn't like. We'll try to place each sort of in their historical context and what ultimately happened with these origins. And then at the end, we will pick which one is each of our favorite origin story for Superman. We will begin in 1986 with The Man of Steel by John Byrne and Dick Giordano. The Man of Steel was a miniseries that was released in the wake of Crisis on Infinite Earths and is, in a sense, a reboot. This is the beginning of the modern Superman, which is technically still the Superman that we see in the pages of comic books today. The series was designed as a 6-issue mini and then launched directly into the ongoing Superman comic book that was running at the time. a whole bunch of changes were made from what had come before. Many of those changes obviously have stuck around to today, including some changes to Superman's background, some changes to his supporting cast. Notably, Lex Luthor is no longer a mad scientist, but sort of a businessman and white collar criminal. And so this is probably, of all the origins, one of the most consequential. It's also one that kind of covers a very uh, large breadth of things. It's the most disjointed, I would say, of all of these, as each issue is sort of a self-contained story that tells one chapter, right? Rather than telling an overarching singular story. One issue is simply dedicated just to Superman and Batman meeting for the first time. Just because this miniseries' goal was not just to tell a new origin story for the Man of Steel, but also to sort of establish him as this is the Superman of the DC universe now. So some relationships, like his relationship with Batman, had to be established pretty early on. So Chris, I'm gonna throw to you. I'm very interested to hear some of the things you liked about this.
Yeah, so first off, I'm no stranger to John Byrne being an X-Men fan. Perhaps one of the most seminal X-Men runs is Chris Claremont and John Byrne. So I've been a fan of John Byrne's art style, less so of John Byrne the individual. And I see some of those personality traits that make him problematic kind of show up in his writing here. Um, his women are written very very tropically, if that makes sense. You have, at the from right from the jump, you have Jor-El being um, this very heroic figure, very intelligent, very measured, and all this, and then you have Lara, Superman's mother, just coming in and shrieking, especially when she sees a topless man. She almost faints when she sees a shirtless farmer. Um, Gave me a good giggle. And that kind of continues. You don't see that as much with Ma Kent because she's just this doting, maternal, very, I guess, what boomer ideal of what a mother should be. She should just be a caretaker and support her child and husband and not a whole lot else. And so she's kind of like a one note character in this. And then Lois is just all over the place, chaotic. Very, very 1980s vibe to this comic. But I mean, it looks good. Like you said, it's pretty disjointed. It's kind of all over the place. The Batman issue was probably my least favorite issue. It was just kind of random. Also, it's going to be hard to sell me on this evil woman named Magpie, and
Magpie, that
and her
character, I
name is like
swear.
Maggie Pyle or something like that. So that was a bit rough, but overall, I can see the influence. I can look past the things I didn't like and appreciate the significance of this miniseries and what it meant for the greater DC universe at large and how it established like the look of Superman, if nothing else.
The look of Superman for sure, right? Like, as I've mentioned
Oh, real quick,
previously,
real quick, real quick. Lana is not characterized well in the final issue either. So she's
no,
just like,
no,
I
Lon,
loved you, but you didn't love me back, so I went a little crazy.
she's not even done yet. That's the joke. When you launch into the ongoing, she gets a little crazier. It's not done with Lana yet. So, so yeah, you're absolutely right, and that this is very much of its time. There's a lot of 1980s stuff here, right? I kind of love the chaotic energy of Lois in this. That carries over into other writers too. I think Lois is in a lot of her incarnations, in a lot of my favorite incarnations, anyways. She is just chaotic energy, right? Like my adventures with Superman right now. I don't know if you've been keeping up with that cartoon. Their second season just started. Holy smokes, is she chaos on that show? And I absolutely love it. It's just there's something about Lois when she's like that. I think my favorite scene in theirs when in Man of Steel is when Clark picks her up for like that dinner on Lexus boat or whatever, and she's like just casually sitting there lifting weights in her dress.
in a ball gown.
No, she just like doesn't give a crap. Like, I appreciate that chaotic Lois a little bit. But yeah, I mean, it's pretty undeniable that this is sort of a defining miniseries for a few reasons, right? One, Superman's look. As a kid of the '90s who kind of grew up in the Triangle era, this is
Hmm.
what Superman looks like. Yeah, I mean, slap some long hair on him, and this is what he looked like for a huge chunk of my reading of Superman, right? Post Death and Return, he still very much has that similar sort of facial structure, right? The general build of him. This is very much Superman. People definitely stayed on model, so to speak, of what Byrne established here. Lois too, right? Very, very much sticks sort of in this wheelhouse.
I would go further. I'd go further and say that it is a pretty trend-setting build for superheroes physique-wise. Like I'm looking at like this final page of issue 6 and I'm like, man, I had so many action figures that looked like that in the 90s.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because later artists will like go really really big, right, with
Hmm.
Superman. And previous artists they didn't go maybe quite as um I don't want to say muscular. He was always muscular, but I like the muscle definition wasn't quite as clear, if that makes sense. In previous
Yeah.
with previous artists, he was a little, um, let's say the muscles were a little more covered up with a little bit of a layer of fat and tissue, right? So I'm
Yeah.
not saying he was necessarily chubby or something, but it was not like the muscle definition wasn't quite as clear. So he's not like huge Arnold Schwarzenegger, but at the same time his musculature is more defined. You're exactly right. It's sort of almost an archetypal build at this point. But it wasn't for Superman before this, right? This is very much an establishment of that. I think my favorite change in this one, though, is the idea of Lex not as the mad scientist, but as this white collar businessman criminal. I think it just adds a whole different layer to their rivalry and their relationship, and it's a lot of fun as that unfolds that rivalry in the ongoing that follows this, right? I think that was one of the smartest changes that's been made to a character at DC. And even now, when they're kind of trying to bring like a scientific background back a little bit, they still are not abandoning the idea that he's like a titan of business and all that, because
Hmm.
there's a natural tendency, and I think that's a big outgrowth of the '80s. Is that there's a natural tendency now that there's a healthy dose of mistrust of like billionaires and business owners and the idea of exploitation of the working class, and that sticks to Lex very nicely in the series. I think he owns that very nicely. This is my city, and everything that happens here is because I'm in control, and I'm the benefactor of the city, and they need to remember who gives them jobs and all that stuff. Like it fits the character to a T, and it kind of harkens back, and I think a lot of ways, to something that kind of got lost a little bit, and frequently gets lost when people write Superman, and that is that Superman at the very beginning, if you go back to the original Action Comics issues, uh, started out very much as sort of like champion of the oppressed, the guy who took on the rich and the powerful, right? And
Hmm.
so putting Lex in that position and then having like here's this incredibly wealthy, incredibly powerful individual, socially, politically powerful. At one point, this version of Lex even becomes president of the United States later on, right? Having that as the opposing force to Superman works incredibly well because it harkens back to his original purposes of I stand for the little guy. I protect the little guy from the people in power who are corrupt, who are misusing their power. So I like that change a great deal. But you're undeniably right in that the way women are written doesn't always land, very much so. Like much of the stuff from the '80s, you sometimes have to punt back a little bit and remember that this is going on what is it now, 40 years old almost, and so of the time is very much something you have to keep in mind, I guess. Any other thoughts on Man of Steel, Chris?
I think it's interesting you say that about Lois. I think the caveat to my previous statement is you can tell that Lois is a favorite character of his, and so she's given the most real estate, the most agency to do that with, even if she makes questionable decisions, like accepting a dress, but then being surprised that it was a gift and not just a loan. That whole thing was kind of weird. But she's given that agency because it's a favorite character of his. So that I think that's interesting. Is this the first appearance of Bizarro? Is this the origin of the character?
This is the origin of this version of the character.
Oh, okay.
Bizarro had been it goes back. I think the original version of Bizarro was like Otto Binder. We talked
Hmm.
about him previously, right?
Yes.
I'm pretty sure the original Bizarro Otto Binder was at the very least involved with. But if I remember correctly, the idea of Bizarro as an imperfect clone
Yeah.
is from here. Um, I think originally there was like a duplication array was something that was used previously. Um, so this is the idea of cloning is established here. So this is a different version of Bizarro than what came before. This version of Bizarro, yes, this is his first appearance, but there had been a Bizarro before that was different than this.
It was as the son of a blind man, it was hard to see how poorly that aspect was written with Lois's sister. Like, oh, I'm blind now. Guess I'll just commit suicide. Like, whoa, let's pump the brakes here. Uh,
Simmer down a little bit.
and um, and so like the whole resolution to that one was a bit odd, but I mean the comic looks great at the same time.
Yeah, I think it's probably fair to say that the ideas behind what's in here are strong, whereas the execution doesn't always necessarily hold up by modern standards. All right, that brings us to the next origin story. So this is interesting. The Man of Steel, which is what we just discussed, stood as the origin of Superman, as the mainline origin of Superman in DC Comics for a very, very long time. This is the version of Superman that went through the Death and Return storyline, that ended up running around with long hair. It's not a mullet, guys. It was long hair. It was not always drawn very well, but it was supposed to be long hair, not a mullet. This is the guy who went electric blue and then got split into two beings and then got merged back together. Our world's at war. All those stories are all basically this Superman. And then we get to 2003, and we get Superman Birthright, which was a 12-issue comic book limited series that ran from 2003 to 2004, written by Mark Waid and drawn by Leinil Francis Yu. And this one was actually
Well,
originally intended.
at this time, it was Lionel Fu.
Well, yeah, fu. Not maybe not the best choice. Anyways, so originally this was actually intended to be a non-canon version of Superman, right? This was sort of an Elseworld story, an update of Superman for the 21st century in the vein of something like Ultimate Spider-Man, right? But it actually landed pretty solidly. There were a lot of people who enjoyed it, and because of that, it was actually for a time adapted as the official or new origin story of Superman. So when Kryptonian characters started like showing up, or there were flashbacks to Krypton or anything like that, you started seeing the designs from Superman Birthright being used for Krypton rather than the designs from Byrne's Man of Steel. Now, interestingly enough, that this is not going to last very long, right? It turns out that Infinite Crisis, one of the 50 billion crisis events that were released by DC over the years, which ran from 2005 to 2006, had once again universe-altering effects, right? And the general sense was that Birthright no longer then at that point was the official origin story. And in fact, both both Birthright and Byrne's Man of Steel were no longer the canonical origin. And so a new origin would then come along later, and that was Superman's Secret Origin. So Birthright was the official
Spoiler
origin for a
alert!
lot,
Spoiler alert! Bad
which we'll get
choice.
to. Yeah. So Birthright was technically the official origin, but only for a couple of years, and then they turned back the clock on that. Why exactly? I'm not sure. Although I have my thoughts on that. So, Chris, let's go ahead and talk about Birthright for a second. What was your reaction to this rather long tale of Superman's origin?
It was rather long. I remember one of our earliest episodes, I want to say it's like 7 or 8. I read the first half of this when you wanted to make it into a film from page to screen episode. And so the first 6 issues I tore through pretty quickly because I had already read them and I was just basically revisiting them. I think it's very much it's interesting to our conversation about the 1986-ness of Man of Steel, but then you also have this being released between 2003 and 2004. We were still in the Bush presidency. This was shortly after 9/11. So like the influence of that is undeniable. You have a general distrust from the public about outsiders, Superman being one of them, even though he presents as a white guy, even despite his alien origins. So there's a distrust there. You have an interesting monologue from an Arabic cab driver while Superman is arriving in Metropolis that kind of further drives home the point in history that this was written. So that was fascinating to watch. The history nerd in me. I will say that the first 2 issues, the Heart of Darkness kind of mini arc, still leave me very uncomfortable. It's a very white savior trope. I think it's well intentioned by Waid, but I don't think a white writer and a white superhero are the appropriate characters to tell this story, as well intentioned as it may be, of these freedom fighters in Africa and the white guy coming in, the white guy journalist coming in and telling everybody how it needs to be. That still doesn't sit well with me. Reading it a second time, however, like you could see the heart's in the right place. It's still a very uncomfortable read, those first 2 issues. But then when we get to Smallville and Metropolis, the story really picks up in quality for me. And this was easily my favorite of the 3. I think I'm a big fan of Leinil Francis Yu to begin with. Similarly to like the time capsule nature of the story itself, it's interesting to see the evolution of Yu's art from what it was in 2003 and 2004 to what it is now when he's doing things for Marvel and DC alike. He did a lot with X-Men that I'm a big fan of. And so it's interesting to see that aspect of it. And it's just also further brings home the point of my affinity for Mark Waid as a writer. I want to read more of his work because every time I've read something by him, I enjoyed it. Um, he even here's how talented Mark Waid, and I know this was something I was teasing before we started recording, and I know I've never watched Smallville, so my opinion may change if I ever decide to take that dive. I'm not a fan of Lex Luthor in Smallville. I'm not. I think it's too convenient, but Waid does it really well here to where I it's palatable. And so I think it's done well here. I think the back and forth between Superman and Luthor is the strongest. I enjoyed it in Man of Steel. But I appreciate the synergy of the mad scientist and the businessman here. I think it works really, really well here. And the entire like last 4 or 5 issues where you get the Kryptonian invasion is just fascinating. And I read the last 4 or 5 issues in probably an hour because it was just good stuff.
Yeah, I've obviously not made a secret over the years on this pod how much I adore Birthright. I got the hardback from years ago when it first came out, sitting on my desk right now as we're talking about this, um, and it's probably one of my favorite Superman stories ever. There's so much in here that I really really love. I did watch Smallville, all 10 seasons when it first aired, and I will tell you that Smallville is a deeply imperfect show. And there's a lot of stuff in it that does not hold up at all when you go back to it. But there were also some
Well,
interesting ideas.
one of the principal actors in that was running a sex trafficking ring, so I'm not exactly jumping at the chance to watch it. So
Well, there's so much heartbreaking stuff that has happened since. I absolutely ride for Jonathan Kent in Smallville. I think it's one of the best written Jonathan Kents
Ooh,
ever. And John Schneider is apparently such a toxic individual now in real life. That is so disappointing.
it's interesting because even as much as I like this Birthright, I was like, oh, no matter the iteration, Jonathan Kent is at least a little bit of an a-hole in every iteration.
Yeah, and I would say that the iteration in Birthright takes a little bit of inspiration from Smallville. I would say, um, the idea that Lex and Clark had known each other in Smallville is not new. It had existed in the comic books before, specifically in like the Superboy comic books, right? In fact, it used to be the thing. I have this issue hanging framed on my wall, but the story used to be that Superboy was responsible for Lex Luthor being bald because of a lab accident, basically. So, but Smallville really popularized this idea again that they tried to be friends when they were younger, and then things turned sour, right? And so that kind of bounces off of this. The design here of Jonathan Kent and some of the vibes that he gives are very Smallville too. Um, and Superman just being a little more conflicted and trying to kind of figure out what his path in life is, that very much is a Smallville vibe too.
Mhm.
That being said, I think it just gets so much right about Superman. I think Waid has such a understanding of what makes the character good and what makes the character tick, that all the time that you get to spend here, 12 issues, getting into his head and understanding how he arrives at being Superman, um, it's a fun ride. And yeah, you're exactly right when you say like merging the mad scientist with the businessman in this for Lex is a genius stroke. I totally agree with that. I really think that the white collar crime element of Lex Luthor is so important. Putting him into a position of power so he can misuse and manipulate people is so important as a way of harkening back to what makes Superman tick as a defender of those that can't defend themselves, right? But at the same time, now adding some of that mad science stuff back in makes him a more viable opponent in a different way, because now he can invent stuff that can hurt Superman, right? Or he uses his brain in a different way to get to him, and I think that's a really really smart synthesis. I like Lois in this a great deal again. I think Lois is a lot of fun in this one. I think just the relationships between the various characters and how they bounce
Mhm.
off of each other works incredibly well. It's hard for me not to say good things about Birthright. I just think it works. I know one of the most controversial things at the time when it was released that came out of this was what they call soul vision, right? So the idea that he can like see like life, like somebody's life
Of an
force with his
aura.
supervision,
Yeah.
like an aura, right? And when something dies, it goes away. And because of that, he becomes a vegetarian. And a lot of people were like, a farm boy from Kansas would never become a vegetarian. It's like, well, I don't. And I was like, dude, if you have soul vision, you might change your mind too. But I always liked that as a really interesting wrinkle to
Yeah.
Superman, because he's like, he has such a deep love and respect for life, right?
Yeah.
That like putting it right there that he even like sees like life, literally life as an aura on people,
Mhm.
and then seeing it fade away. Like that's one of my favorite scenes in the book. It's like that how he talks about like how heartbreaking it is to see literally life draining out of somebody and how that deeply affected him. I think that's such a Superman thing that, although it was incredibly controversial at the time, I really loved it. And I have to say, I really like Krypton here too, the general design of Krypton. And the fashion of Krypton and everything, and how they kind of like try to make the connection between what Superman wears and how that's basically like connected to the fashion of
Hmm.
Krypton. I really like that because his suit in the Byrne version has nothing in common with what Kryptonians were wearing, right? So in a
Yeah.
way, he's sort of wearing the colors of his planet, so to speak. I think that's a really, really cool move too. And of course, this is where we get the idea from that the S stands for hope, right? So,
Yeah.
suck it, Zack Snyder. This is where that came from, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think my favorite moment of any of this reading comes at the end of issue 10 where he's just like given up. But then he sees like the symbol as you know, as destruction. It symbolizes destruction. And then he just like looks down all of his stuff, drops his glasses and says, like hell, and comes back. And I'm like, all right, let's go. And that's when I read like two issues, like speed read the last two issues because I was like, all right, I was pumped. And I think the other thing that really stands out to me is the level of skill that Waid has when it comes to character work. My heart was broken by two characters. First being Superman, how incredibly lonely that must be. You are the last son of Krypton. You're the only one that can see these auras. You are doing your damnedest to protect this world, and only for them to treat you as an outsider and an outcast and a strangeling and unwelcome while you're literally trying to save their lives. Um, and then to the point where like the only real support system that you have, um, Clark, he and Lois have this kind of tiffy rivalry. She doesn't really give him the time of day for the most part. Which the one thing I forgot to say about Byrne's run, I strongly disliked Lois's treatment of Clark. I don't like the pettiness of getting the scoop, and she was kind of giving him crap, and she never really liked him. And maybe that'll change if I were to continue reading, but that never sat right with me. So the loneliness and solitude of Superman was heartbreaking. But I think even to a greater degree, as a parent of um, kids on the spectrum, and as someone who's taught innumerable kids on the spectrum, I absolutely read Lex Luthor as an autistic individual who was completely misunderstood, who was neglected, who was abused, who was mistreated, and that's his villain origin story, and that was incredibly heartbreaking to where I had to kind of take a break from reading when I made that realization.
Yeah, yeah. You know what else is really interesting to me? And I think we've talked about this before. It's just those last two pages. There is something, there is something so like shot in the gut, right? Like
Oh,
when
absolutely.
he manages to send that message back to his birth parents that he made it right before they pass. Like that is so such a powerful ending to the story. It rattles me every time when I read it. Like it gets me every time. It's dude, it's just a special book.
It really is. And I'm not one for physical comics, but I might be. This might be a purchase that I make very soon.
Yeah, it's like I said, I have the hardback sitting on my bookshelf, and it's one of my favorites to get out and reread frequently. Which brings us to the third and final origin that we're going to look at this time around, which is Superman Secret Origin, which was written by Geoff Johns with art by Gary Frank and was released between 2009 and 2010. Was released as the then official new origin of Superman. Now, there's a few things to mention here. Johns was at the time really involved with Superman. He had gotten, I think, involved big time with actually with Richard Donner. Donner was actually co-writing a little bit with him for a little while on the monthly Superman title. And spinning out of that, you started seeing, a big resemblance of the mainline Superman being represented sort of in a Christopher Reeve fashion, right? Gary Frank was doing art on a fair amount of that, trying to make him look as much as Chris Reeve as possible. And if you look at Secret Origin and then bounce over to what was going on in the monthly Superman books at the time, there are things mentioned, particularly in the second issue with the Legion of Superheroes, where they are, using their future knowledge to hint at storylines that basically Johns was cooking up at the time for the monthly book, right? So Secret Origin was the new origin of Superman, but also was supposed to be in some ways a hint of what was coming up in the monthly Superman books. Now, Secret Origin is weird, right? In that technically, you would think it still stands as the official origin of Superman, but since it's been released, we've gone through some stuff at DC, including the New 52, right, which completely rebooted everything. And then also we went through Rebirth, which essentially restored the previous version of the DC universe from before the New 52. But since things have been restored, there has not been a whole lot in the way of explanation which of the previous origins have been now officially restored. It seems that most people kind of still defer all the way back to Man of Steel as far as origin of this version of Superman. But it's very possible that officially DC is still referring back to this as the current up-to-date origin story of Superman, which... Well, let's talk about it, Chris. What was your reaction to Secret Origin?
Why? Seriously, why? I read this one first, so it's been a while. I'm kind of scrolling quickly to kind of refresh my memory. It just kind of feels, and you laid this out, it feels very much like a Chris Reeve cosplay. Like they were clearly going for the nostalgia bait and just it did not execute anything. It didn't stand out. It was extremely forgettable. Um it's just people like we go from a very nuanced I just said that the character of Lex Luthor broke my heart in the previous series to where now he's just this cartoonishly evil, like the facial expressions on some of these close-ups. I don't like to criticize art too much because I have no artistic skill to speak of, but it's unnerving, some of the facial expressions and the close-ups for Lex Luthor in particular, a little bit creepy. Um Maybe I'm losing some context not having been reading the the concurrent Superman that was going on that you mentioned, but this really did nothing for me. Um Lex is just very cartoonishly written here. There is no nuance, like I said. There is no feeling bad for him. There is no sympathy. There is no empathy. I think that, and I'm not very familiar on this character, but Lois's dad just feels like a knockoff Thunderbolt Ross, like from the Hulk comics. Um, and then you have um, a parasite janitor guy in his underwear that turns purple. I'm not sure what that was supposed to be, where that was headed. Maybe I missed something, but this was extremely forgettable, and I did not enjoy it.
Yeah, so talking about Secret Origin is tough because I'm, as a Superman fan, longtime Superman fan, I sometimes feel like I'm a little bit of an outlier. So let me go ahead and just tell you that when it came out, this was a very well-received book. Let me go ahead and try to hit you with some numbers. According to Comic Book Roundup, Superman Secret Origin received an average rating of 8.6 out of 10 based on 47 reviews. IGN gave high praise to the overall series, most individual issues receiving ratings between 7.8 and 9.0. So this was very well received at the time. I think according to Wikipedia here, iFanboy gave the finale to the series full ratings, but stated the series as a whole is a conservative retelling when compared to Mark Waid's Superman Birthright. And I think that's really the biggest problem that I have with Secret Origin is that it's basically a nostalgia tour. This is a very, very nostalgic book. And it is nostalgic mainly for two things. It is nostalgic for pre-crisis Superman. It is nostalgic for the setup that Superman, as a young boy, always had powers, which is something that Byrne got rid of in Man of Steel. To him,
Byrne
he didn't
said,
start
"I
having his
have
power.
no time for children."
Well, yeah, Byrne's idea was basically that yeah, Superman gets his powers from the sun, right? And so it took him years to basically for his body to charge up, right? And so by the time he's a late teen,
You
he
could you
starts
could tell
manifesting his
you could tell
powers.
you could tell he worked on X-Men previously.
Yeah, yeah. So it took him years to charge up, and that also means that there were no adventures as Superboy flying around or anything, traveling to the future with the Legion of Superheroes, any of that, right? The idea was he has a normal childhood, he's an all-American boy, and then when he becomes a late teenager, he starts manifesting these powers. Finished, right? And that solves some storytelling issues, like how do you raise a superpowered toddler, for example? Like it already feels like my 3-year-old is superpowered sometimes. I don't want to know what he would do if he'd start flying around the house. Um, so he wants this back. Like very much Johns wants this stuff back. He wants Superboy back. He wants the Legion of Superheroes and him going to the future back. He wants him flying around Smallville in his Superman suit. All of the stuff that sort of went away with Crisis of Infinite Earths, Johns wants back. This is very much the nostalgia tour. And then the other thing that it's nostalgic for is very much the 1978 Superman movie. So here we get a Clark Kent that is very reminiscent of Chris Reeve Clark Kent, right? And this is again something that
It's also
that
pre-crisis, right?
yes, also pre-crisis, which is also something that Burnett moved away from, right? His Clark Kent was not nearly as meek, right? He was
Mm-hmm.
a little bit more assertive, and so this is very much something that is just like it's not breaking any new ground. It is basically just going back to how things were before. It's the most basic of basics, and where I think I appreciated Superman Birthright a lot more is that it moves things into a modern age. It brings some modern sensibilities to things. It doesn't jettison everything that's been accomplished since those days of Superboy flying around Smallville, and it establishes something new and different and is forward looking. And Secret Origin is 100% backward looking. It's looking backward to an old movie, it's looking backward to pre-crisis continuity, and that's what it's most interested in is the past. And because of that, I don't think it works really well as a forward looking origin for Superman. Um, and maybe that's just me.
I just noticed something. Jimmy Olsen looks like Lex's little brother. Like the art is incredibly similar.
Kind of does, doesn't he? All right, Chris. So if you had to pick a favorite out of the three, which one would it be and why?
Oh, it's far and away Birthright. It's just a much more cohesive story. Maybe that is inherent in a 12 issue series versus a 6, but I think like it just has a clear plot. It has a clear theme that it wants to tell. Even in the missteps in the first 2 issues, it is still consistent with the theme of the book of hope, of changing for the better, of standing for something bigger than yourself, for helping others. So it's just and I think there's a line in there, I can't remember where or who says it, about like hope, kind of superseding cynicism and whatever. So that was really impactful. I can't remember, like I said, exactly where I saw it. I think it was in there though. But that was really, really powerful. Um, so yeah, I'd have to pick Birthright of the three.
Yeah, out of the three, to me, too, as a longtime Superman fan, Birthright is by far my favorite origin story. I will say that I still have a great deal of fondness for Man of Steel. I think it comes in at a solid number 2 for
I
me.
I
It's
agree.
obviously it's obviously dated in a lot of ways, and Byrne is has some proclivities that don't always land. But at the same time, it very much is the origin story for my Superman, if that makes sense, the
Hmm.
version of Superman that I grew up with, right? I kind of came up in the Triangle era. That's where I cut my teeth. Death and Return of Superman and the Mold era and all that stuff. And this is that Superman's origin. This the Superman that revealed his secret identity to Lois Lane and proposed, and they got married. That's Superman's origin. And so I still have a fondness for that because that's my Superman. But I can see Birthright being a worthy update of an origin for that Superman. Secret Origin out of the three is by far my least favorite because there's just nothing forward looking.
Hmm.
Man of Steel at the time it was released was very much forward looking. It tried something new, it established something new, and it was built upon for
Which is
decades
saying
afterwards.
something. Which is saying something when your central character is the man of tomorrow, and you're traveling into the future in the second issue.
Yes, and Birthright too was forward looking. It tried to set up something new. Now, it didn't last long as the official origin story because DC and their crisis shenanigans, but I think it had the potential to be a solid foundation for a shift in the kind of storytelling they do in the main Superman books, which regrettably never happened. But it too is a forward looking book. Secret Origin is not that, right? It's just backwards looking. It's just nostalgia bait, basically. And so for me, the rankings are really clear. It's Birthright at the top, followed by Man of Steel, ultimately then followed by Secret Origin, which trails really, really far behind in my book.
I have a nagging question as our resident Superman historian that throughout all three still tugs at me, bothers me. Less so in Birthright, but it's still there. Were the Kents wrong for keeping Clark so in the dark?
It's an interesting question.
Like so in the
And
dark.
yeah, and I think various different versions obviously do various different things. Um, the My Adventures with Superman seems to establish that he sort of always knew he was adopted at the very least, right?
Hmm.
Which I think would be like the bare minimum of what they should probably tell their kid. I
Yeah.
mean, if you adopt the kid, the general consensus among um, adoption experts these days is that if you adopt an infant, that you basically raise them with the knowledge of being adopted.
Yeah.
That way, you never have that moment of where you have to look at them and create a moment of shock where you say, "Oh, BT Dubs,
Right.
psych, you're adopted."
Yeah.
And so I think those experts in a situation like this, which is obviously fictional, would probably say raise them with the knowledge to begin with that they're an alien, and then they never have to go through this trauma of having to accept that.
Yeah.
Um, of course,
The
then you
the crisis, if you'll
the
forgive the pun.
crisis, yeah, the identity crisis, which is also a book from DC. But I think then from a writing perspective, uh, you're missing the opportunity to tell that scene, then to tell that story of him having to find out that he is an alien and how he deals with that, right?
Hmm.
So from a writing perspective, don't let the Kents tell him from the get go, because then you're losing a really good opportunity to have a scene that tells you a lot about the character and how he deals with finding out, right? But from a like psychological health of the child perspective, by God, they probably should have just raised him with that knowledge to begin with.
At the very least, I think the bare minimum is to tell him that he's adopted, and you could just plead ignorance on the other stuff. Like, I think there's like certain stages of that. I'm not saying that here at 4 or 5 years old, be like, hey, here's the rocket ship. But I mean, like, I think there are gradual stages to that.
Yeah, but again, I think from a writing perspective, the reason that they don't go that route is because they want the drama of that moment in the story, right? Like
I
being
think there's
faced with the
and
alienness of it all.
and I get that, but I think there's still like so much real estate built within that of things that the Kents don't know. They don't know specifically about Krypton. They don't know the specifics of all of that. So there's still discovery that is available there, I think.
And that's actually one of the fun things that came out Man of Steel back then, right? Is that the origin doesn't tell Superman everything about his homeworld, right? And so there's a lot of stuff that he kind of still is discovering as he goes when you get into the monthly book. There's a lot of stuff that he still has to figure out about himself, his powers, where he's from. That is, I think, something that sometimes origin stories kind of want to have too many answers in them for some superheroes, right? And then there's no real estate to dig into anymore. I mean, I'm not saying that every superhero needs to be Wolverine, where it takes like decades to figure out where he's from or
Mm-hmm.
something. But leaving some questions unanswered and spending a little time with that can be fertile ground for some interesting stories. And I think that's something that Man of Steel did really well. And I think Birthright did too. I think Birthright left a lot of doors open for further exploration.
Yeah, you don't want Sherlock solving the crime in the prologue.
Exactly. Exactly. Alrighty, folks, there you have it. Out of all of these Superman origin stories, which one is your favorite and why? You can find us on social media and let us know all about it. Do you agree with our assessment that Mark Waid and Leinil Francis Hughes' Birthright is the definite Superman origin story, or do you have a dissenting opinion? You can find us at Nerd Byword or individually at that Nerd Dave and at that Nerd Chris. Let's take a quick break. When we are back, it's time for, you guessed it, Nerd Commendations. Ladies and gentle people, we are back, and it's time for the segment where we recommend some nerdy goodness to you. It is time for... Chris, what are you recommending to our good listeners this week?
Well, this is a follow-up to a previous nerd commendation. I previously nerd commended Death of Doctor Strange, which was a 5-issue miniseries by Jed McKay and Lee Garbett that led directly into Strange 1 through 10 by Jed McKay and Marcelo Ferreira, and then into Doctor Strange, which is the current series by Jed McKay and Pasquale Ferry, and just basically anything that's Doctor Strange since 2021 and Jed McKay has come on board as the scribe is good stuff. If you see Jed McKay period as the writer on a comic, it's good. It's gonna be good. It's getting up there with like an Al Ewing hit rate on good comics. So this tells the story of the death of Stephen, his wife Clea taking on the moniker uh, of the Sorcerer Supreme and her adventures there. Wong's entailed in that. I don't want to spoil too much, but like it's just really kind of ambitious in the art. And I'm a newcomer to Doctor Strange comics, so this might be par for the course. But the art in all of these series is really explorative and it's really fun and ambitious and there's some great character moments, and the biggest results out of this is Clea Strange is one of my favorite Marvel characters now. I think she's incredible. She has an interesting backstory with her parentage, her upbringing, her familial relationships, and then her relationship with Steven is incredibly powerful and lovely. And this is how you write married couples in comics. Take note, Marvel. This is how you write married couples in comics. This is good stuff. So I'm telling you what, Jed McKay, between Moon Knight, between Avengers, Doctor Strange, and now Blood Hunt, these are peak comic books, man.
A married couple at Marvel?
Right?
Could it be? Could it be? No, I really want to check this out because I haven't read a whole bunch of Doctor Strange, just a little bit, right? But I know nothing about his like wife character here at all. What's her name again?
Clea, who
I
is
know nothing about Clea.
who is
Like nothing.
portrayed who
Like
is portrayed by Charlize Theron at the in the end credits. So if we get another Doctor Strange film, that's going to be incredible.
yeah. So I just think I need to lay into this because that sounds absolutely fascinating, right? That's just a corner of that's just a corner of the Marvel universe that I don't know much about. So time for me to explore a little bit. This sounds really interesting, Chris. I'm gonna have to check this out.
And I've previously nerd commended it, but the Strange Academy books is really really fun too, where they have like these young kids from all all realms of the Marvel universe as these young magic wielders. If you love like teen books, team up books, like that's a really fun one as well. That one is the original series is written by Scotty Young with art by Humberto Ramos and Edgar Delgado, but that's good stuff too. So if it's magic based, it's probably a good book. I'm just telling you.
Yeah, might be worth checking out then.
All right. This is our weekly sermon on the benefits and the blessings of a Steam Deck.
Blessed be the Steam Deck. No, so actually, what I'm wanting to talk a little bit about is the great dirty word, emulation. As we have talked about a lot in recent news stories, the emulation scene has been kind of shook by Nintendo coming pretty strongly after the Switch emulator Yuzu. As well as various forks of Yuzu. Now they also have gone after a website that has been around since I think like the 1990s, the mid 1990s, called Whim's Lair, which has been hosting ROMs of various kinds for ever, it seems like, and has been never bothered really by Nintendo before. They had to remove massive amounts of ROMs for various systems. So the emulation scene is very much shook right now. I'm really not wanting to talk about ROMs and you know where you get them from or anything like that. What I want to talk a little bit about though is if you're interested in emulation, how in the world to get the emulators, because for the most part the emulators themselves, right, are not really in legal question here, and emulation is particularly good on various handheld systems like the Steam Deck, like the ROG Ally, right? There's various handheld devices out there right now. You can Android devices, right, like a good smartphone. And there is a wealth of various emulators out there, and it can take forever to figure out which emulator you want to use to emulate which system and how to do, you know, all the configuration. And it's a very overwhelming world out there, the emulation scene. Now, if you actually want to do some handheld emulation and you want to make it a little easier on yourself, the place to go is EmuDeck. EmuDeck was originally put together for the Steam Deck specifically, but they have now versions that run on Windows, on Android, and what it basically is, it's a one installer that takes care of everything behind the scenes for you. It installs various emulators, it configures them for you. It has a compression tool which allows you to compress ROMs to save space. It puts together cloud saves for you, so it syncs your saves from various games up. It has a BIOS checker to make sure your BIOS are there. Has some power tools and the like. It's a very, very solid tool that kind of lowers the entry level for getting into emulation a little bit. So basically what you do is you download this one installer, you tell it which, you know, systems you want to emulate, and it does all the heavy lifting for you behind the scenes. It's a solid system. I specifically have used the Steam Deck version, as the Steam Deck is my gaming device of choice right now, and it is absolutely fantastic on the Steam Deck. Very, very easy. The biggest advice is always to make sure your various components are always up to date, because everything is working together. But you can do all of that within EmuDeck. You just, you know, launch it, and then from there you can update various individual emulators, and also run, you know, like diagnostic tests to make sure all the pieces that you need to make a particular emulator work are there. It's a fantastic system, and it's just made a process, you know, setting up various emulators that could have taken, you know, days and weeks, much simpler and faster. So if you're into the emulation scene at all and you want to do some emulating on a Steam Deck or on a Windows PC or on an Android device, I would check out EmuDeck. I think you'll find that it makes your life a whole lot easier.
I'm just going to kind of color outside the lines here and just nerd commend in general. Go for whatever makes you happy as a gamer. Video gaming should be an escapism. It should get you out of the rigors of the real world, and it should just make you happy. For you, that's the Steam Deck. For me, it's this beautiful gaming laptop that I recently purchased, and I am now playing so many games that I didn't have access to before because of it. I finally stopped being kind of a penny pincher and kind of splurged and treated myself, and I haven't really looked back since. So video games are awesome, man, right?
They are, aren't they ever? Alrighty, folks, there you have it. That's it for another episode of the Nerd Byword podcast. If you like what you just heard, get on your favorite podcasting platform, give us a rating, give us a review, and subscribe so you never miss another episode. You can find us wherever podcasts are available, Apple Podcasts, TuneIn Radio, Spotify, etc., etc., and of course, our very own spiffy website, nerdbyword.com.
It's not a complete episode without you saying spiffy. You can also find us on social media, interact with us, talk crap with us, talk comics with us, talk games with us, give reactions to the episode, things you'd like to see in a future episode. Give us some ideas. Hit us up on social at Nerd Byword or individually that Nerd Dave and that Nerd Chris. And most importantly, stay well and stay nerdy.
The Nerd Byword is written and produced by Chris and Dave, two nerds with a love of all things pop culture. The podcast features music by Al Jimenez with additional drops composed by Joe Biondi. Our show art is by Ashery Design. Find us at nerdbyword.com and wherever podcasts are available.